皆さんこんにちは。ごーしん心理ラボのごーしんです。アビー・ローブ博士がテレビで 3i アトラスの最新の異常について解説しております。本日はですね、FOX32 シカゴという、YouTube チャンネルというか、テレビ番組を YouTube にアップロードしたような動画がございまして、これが最新版のアビー・ローブ博士のテレビ出演の動画になります。そして2026年の1月22日に太陽地球 3i アトラスという形でほぼほぼ一直線にですね整列しました。それによって 3i アトラスの周りにぼやーっとしたハローがあるんですけれども、そのハローが観測上邪魔されにくいというか邪魔しにくいような状態で好条件で観測できるんだよっていう日をですね通過しました。そして最新のその画像なんですけれども、こちらですね。これがハッブル宇宙望遠鏡からの画像で、それをラーソン・セカニナフィルターにかけたやつですね。これ回転勾配フィルターです。3i アトラスの周りにまとっているこのハロの部分っていうのが消し飛んだような状態ですね。非常に分かりやすくなっています。でこちらのミディアムの記事の方でもですね、最新の情報っていうのは書いてあるんですけど、本日は直接ご本人の動画を一緒に見てまいりましょう。でこの FOX シカゴの動画の方は翻訳機能がオフになっちゃってるんですよね。アップロード側の設定の影響だと思うんですけど、私 Adobe Premiere Pro で動画編集ソフトを使ってですね、一個一個全部翻訳しました。ですから字幕日本語で出てまいります。ぜひですね、その字幕の方皆さん見ながらご覧ください。途中ですね、分かりにくいところは私が解説してまいります。1.25 倍で流しますが、15分程度の少し長い動画になりますんで、皆さんリラックスしてどうぞ最後までご覧ください。それでは参りましょう。そしてチャンネル登録も忘れないでください。
It's a great pleasure to join you.
All right, so this new paper is about 3IATLAS being at a rare full moon phase. Was that just a few hours ago?
Well, it happened yesterday, and very gladly, the Hubble Space Telescope was looking at it because some places on Earth were cloudy, and I know from observers that couldn't really take good data of it. But just a few hours ago, I received an analysis of the first data from the Hubble Space Telescope on January 22nd, and it looks very interesting. What we see is, once again, this anti-tail, a plume of gas and dust pointed towards the sun. The special thing about January 22nd is that we are looking at the object, 3IATLAS, from the direction of the sun. That's an amazing alignment to within 0.69 degrees that I pointed out in a paper that was published yesterday, just on the day of this alignment. We don't get that privilege very often, even with objects within our solar system. But here we are talking about an interstellar visitor that is very puzzling, and it happens to be yesterday on January 22nd, 2026, opposite to the direction of the sun relative to us. And that means that it's very similar to a situation with a full moon, where the object is being illuminated by the sun and there is no shadow, no part of the object which is shadowed by the other part. And so we can actually see the reflection of sunlight from the object as well as from dust around it in its full glory, and learn from the brightness rise through the
はい、冒頭で私が説明したような内容を今話しています。満月と似たような状況で 3i アトラスが非常に見やすい位置に太陽、地球、3i アトラスと整列した。それが1月22日で 0.69 度以内のズレに収まっている。これは我々の太陽系の天体でもなかなかないことだよって言っています。
surge in brightness of 3IATLAS yesterday. From that rise, the level that it gets to, and the rate by which it rises, we can learn about the composition and the size of the dust grains around it, and also something about the object itself, because the anti-tail, this jet that we often saw from the side, pointed towards the sun, is pointing at us. Actually, the rotation axis, the object is rotating every 7.1 hours. This is based on another paper that I submitted for publication a few days ago. We measured the rotation period from the periodic variations in the brightness of the object, but also from the fact that the jet system around it is wobbling, just like the beam of light from a lighthouse that is wobbling around the rotation or axis of the lighthouse. So we see those jets wobbling in the sky because of the rotation of the object every 7.1 hours or so. And now, actually, the rotation axis is very close to the direction of us, the direction of Earth and the Sun, and also the anti-tail, this jet that is pointed towards the Sun that we saw wobbling, is now almost pointed at us. But the good news is that we shouldn't worry too much about it pointed at us, because I did a calculation that shows that none of the toxic materials which are being shed by 3IATLAS, for example, we know that there is that there are some materials that are not really good for our health, and it will have no chance of reaching the Earth. Because the object itself is moving very fast at 60 kilometers per second, and that material is moving with it. It's also being pushed by the solar wind and the solar radiation away from us. And the orbit of 3IATLAS never really went through the circle that the Earth makes around the Sun, so there is no risk that these materials will reach us. But it gives us an opportunity to look at it.
今ここで話しているのは 3i アトラスから発せられる有害な物質ですよね。シアン化物とかありましたよね。ああいったものが秒速 60km で今現在地球から遠ざかっているような状況になっているから、地球にその物体が届くことはないんだよ。3i アトラスと一緒に飛んでいるから、そこは安心して大丈夫なんだよ。リスクはありませんよ。ただしその物質をですね、正面から見る今絶好のチャンスなんだよということを言っています。
This on, and I looked at the image that was obtained on January 22nd, and what I see is, in addition to the anti-tail, once again there is a system of 3 mini jets. These are small jets coming out of the nucleus of the object after you remove the spherically symmetric glow around it. So there is a way of filtering out the smooth glow, the spherically symmetric glow around it, and then you are left with 3 jets after applying this filter, which is called Larson-Sekanina filter. And then the 3 jets are separated by 120 degrees, equally from each other on the sky. It looks like a very geometric, symmetric structure. And, you know, the interesting question is whether that is a technological signature, because if you just have random spots on the surface of a rock that have pockets of ice on them, why would they be organized in such an orderly fashion of 3 mini jets equally separated from each other on the sky, in addition to this anti-tail, which is opposite to what you usually see in comets? You see a tail extending away from the sun. So this jet structure is really peculiar, not explained. It makes one of the anomalies in the list that I provided on medium.com.
And you have explained quite a bit there that I'm sure everyone's kind of leaning in on, and we're already starting to get some questions from our viewers who just love.
今の部分で話していたのは、私の前回の動画でお話しした3つのジェットですね。120度ごとに均等にこう分かれて放出されている。それが基本的には 3i アトラスの進行方向で出ているんです。そして後ろの極の方からアンチテールで太陽方向に地球の直径約10個分の長さまで今伸びています。アンチテールがめちゃめちゃ伸びてるんですね。でこの3つのジェット、どう考えても自然なものとはちょっと考えにくいんじゃないのかっていうところがですね、巷で騒がれているわけです。動画続きいきます。
To kind of, poke away at your mind here. One of the questions we have you seen the clearest images of Atlas?
Yeah, so what we see in the image, we can't really see the nucleus because the resolution of the Hubble Space Telescope is not good enough at that distance to resolve the nucleus. It was never good enough, and it would have been much better to have a mission that intercepts the path of 3IATLAS so that we can get a close-up photograph of it. But we don't have that. So all we see is a glowing halo around it, which is extended in the direction of the sun because of the anti-tail. That's what we see in the Hubble image now. That's what we saw in the Hubble image that was obtained early on July 21st, 2025, when the object was heading towards the sun. And that's unusual that there is this anti-tail, a physical jet. It's not a matter of perspective. It's not as if we're looking at it from some special angle, so it looks as if it's pointing at the sun. It actually is pointing at the sun. It was doing that all the way, from the beginning until now. And the question is, what's the physical origin of this anti-tail, which is very peculiar given, what we know about other comets that usually, show a tail away from the sun. But the more peculiar fact is that there are these mini jets that are very symmetrically oriented around the nucleus, and is it related perhaps to a system of thrusters? And I got a number of emails from people who work on propulsion and stabilization of spacecraft, and they said that that is the kind of design that was proposed by some engineers in the past to stabilize spacecraft along two dimensions, and if they rotate along the third dimension, you can imagine the antitail is representing the third axis. So it could be a technological signature, but it's not a clear-cut evidence for technology. And of course, we are all waiting to see what will happen on March 16th, 2026, when 3IATLAS will come closest to Jupiter, and it comes exactly at the distance where Jupiter's gravity starts dominating relative to the Sun's gravity. So the fundamental question is whether it will release any objects that will become satellites of Jupiter. And a natural rock will never do that, because in order to deposit objects that will stay bound gravitationally to Jupiter, they need to cancel out the motion of 3IATLAS, which is quite large relative to Jupiter. So if we see anything like it, we have the Juno spacecraft monitoring Jupiter right now, and we will have two other spacecraft reaching Jupiter by 2030, 2031. And these are the European Space Agency's missions that are called the JUICE and the Europa Clipper. So they're on their way there. And, if there are any new objects around Jupiter, especially at the Lagrange points, we would notice that.
You mentioned Jupiter, and one of our viewers just asked.
今の非常に重要ですね。JUICE という、その探査機とエウロパクリッパーという探査機です。これらがもしも 3i アトラスから探査機が放出されていたら、それらの探査機が発見するだろう、プロープを発見するだろうというふうに言っています。それが2030年とか2031年の話なんで、だいぶ先の話にはなっちゃうんですよね。
Could it slingshot around Jupiter and head back toward Earth?
Yeah, that's in principle possible, because the speed of the object, 3IATLAS, is 60 kilometers per second, which happens to coincide with the escape speed from the surface of Jupiter. Jupiter is not a solid object, it's a gaseous planet, a very massive gaseous planet, may have some rock at its center, but it's also diffuse, and it's a gas giant planet. And but at the surface of Jupiter, the escape speed of, if you wanted to launch a spacecraft that would escape Jupiter, it would need to have a speed of 60 kilometers per second, which is exactly the speed of 3IATLAS. And if 3IATLAS were to graze the surface of Jupiter, it would actually be deflected significantly along its path and could, in principle, return back towards Earth. But it's not coming any so close to Jupiter. It's actually, according to the current trajectory, it will pass within 53.5 million kilometers from Jupiter. So it doesn't look like it's coming close enough to be deflected significantly, and we should expect it to continue along its path. But it could release some smaller objects, of course, and that's what we should monitor for. Of course, if it released already some small objects, they could find the Earth by now or in a few months from now. I was talking before about toxic material that is not able to maneuver. We know that 3IATLAS released the cyanide, for example, that would have been quite harmful for life on Earth, but it will never reach us. No concerns about that.
Very interesting stuff. Now, someone's...
今の部分非常に重要でしたね。もしかしたら木星のその重力に引っ張られて 3i アトラスが戻ってくることがあり得るのかという質問に対して 100% ゼロではないという回答を、アビローブ博士も言っていましたよね。これ今日の動画のタイトルちょっと変えて出すかもしれないですね。
Do you have any update on the CIA refusing to confirm or deny that they have gathered files on Atlas?
Well, no, they are not disclosing any of that. They say that they cannot deny nor confirm the existence or non-existence of such materials, documents. And to me, that illustrates the fact that they did have conversations. And we know that it was not, these conversations were not limited to the US, because there was an end of the year summary in Russia where Vladimir Putin was asked by a journalist what he heard from the intelligence agencies that he has about 3IATLAS. And he was very knowledgeable about 3IATLAS and said that the scientists informed him that it's just a comet. And so these discussions, these conversations happened obviously.
今の部分単なるコメントだとって書いてあったけど、単なるコメット、彗星だっていうふうにロシアのプーチン大統領は聞かされたというふうに言っています。
In Russia, but at the moment, at least, the public message is that this is just a comet, nothing to worry about. There's no technology, there is no evidence. However, these conversations are not really addressing the fundamental questions about the anomalies of 3IATLAS, which are the most interesting aspects. The only opportunity for us to learn is by paying attention to the unusual facts about 3IATLAS. As I mentioned, the existence of this system of three jets around the nucleus, and actually the orientation of the trajectory, the path of 3IATLAS in the orbital plane of the planets.
The anti-tail. I'm learning here. So you were mentioning Russian President Vladimir Putin and his response to this, and it leads me to one of the questions that was just posed online. Are scientists in other countries paying as close of attention as you and others here in the U.S.?
Yes, in fact, some of my collaborators are in other countries. I have two collaborators from Italy, and they are very focused on getting as much data as possible. One of them just wrote to me overnight. I read it before my morning jog at sunrise, in freezing Boston. And he said, in principle, we cannot detect objects as big as a football field beyond 10 times the Earth-Sun separation. And that is true. And so in principle, if there was a base of technological objects, let's say, beyond the orbit of Neptune, and these objects would be of order the size of objects that we develop. The biggest object that we produced is the Starship rocket, and it's about 120 meters in size, including the booster. So such an object, including the booster, would not be visible. It would not reflect enough sunlight for our best telescopes to detect it beyond the distance of Neptune. So there could be a lot of objects out there that we've never noticed. And if there is a camp of such technological objects out there, we would not know about it unless one of them comes close. And of course, this assumes that we can only detect them from the reflection of sunlight. We have a lamppost, the sun, that allows us to search for keys under the lamppost. But if any of these objects generates their own light, of course, we could detect them even if they're smaller in size. And I wrote a scientific paper I published in 2011 talking about sources of artificial lights in the outer solar system. In principle, if there is an object that produces as much light as the city of Tokyo at the distance of Pluto, we can potentially detect it with the deepest images of the Hubble Space Telescope, the James Webb Space Telescope. We should be able to detect a city like Tokyo in the outskirts of the solar system. So, and it's easy to tell that it produces its own light and not just reflecting sunlight, because an object like that will change its brightness inversely with distance squared, just like a light bulb, whereas an object that reflects sunlight is getting dimmer much faster as it goes inversely with distance to the fourth power. So we can tell the difference between an object that produces its own light and an object that is just reflecting sunlight. But there wasn't any serious search for such objects. And in fact, I asked one of the pioneers who found many trans-Neptunian objects beyond the distance of Neptune, the farthest planet. I asked him whether his name is Tim Brown, and whether he checked if any of them produces their own light. And Mike Brown said, no, why should I check? It's obvious that they're just reflecting sunlight. The brightness should change inversely with distance to the fourth, and he didn't really check. So many times in science, the fact that we cannot imagine something different than what we are used to prevents us from checking.
Yeah, I could totally understand that. You were mentioning a lot about light and the sun, and someone asked, with the bright sun, will that give us better pictures?
Yes, in principle, we would get a better image of 3IATLAS. There should be a brightness surge that was available to us on January 22nd. And my hope is that in the coming days and weeks, we will see that those measurements of how much brighter did 3IATLAS get. It's not just the nucleus, it's also the dust particles. For the same reason, it doesn't matter which object we're talking about. When they're illuminated from the same direction that we are observing them, they get brighter, and just like the full moon. And so my hope is that we can learn much more about those dust particles, the structure of them. There should also be a change in the polarization of the light that is reflected by them, depending on the angle that we are observing them relative to the sun. So all of that information, I actually suggested that observers around the world will look at it at 3IATLAS on January 22nd. My hope is that some of them did.
All right, so where do we go from here? You marked March 16, that's sitting in my head now, as another time that we need to have another conversation with you. But what happens now?
Yeah, so there is a lot of data that was collected when 3IATLAS came closest to Earth that is not available publicly. The teams that have that data did not disclose it. That includes data from the Webb telescope. They're still analyzing it, presumably, and writing their scientific papers. And once this data comes out and all the data that leads us to March 16th, when 3IATLAS will come closer to Jupiter, once all of that data is available publicly, it will be very clear as to whether we can understand the anomalies of 3IATLAS in terms of some natural processes. And at that point, I will be glad to speak with you and tell you my opinion about how likely this object is to be natural versus technological. As of now, it's most likely to be natural, but it might display some new anomalies that make it really strange.
はい、ということでいかがだったでしょうか。木星にこれから接近していくんだけれども、今の 3i アトラスの軌道から考えると、その木星からぐるんと回って地球にまた来るっていうのは考えにくい距離にいると。ただ物理的には可能である。そういうふうに動画の中でおっしゃっていました。そして1月22日に撮影された 3i アトラスの詳細な画像の分析が現在進んでいる段階ですね。これらの情報、データの解析をひたすら待ち続けるしかないようです。それにしてもアビー・ローブ博士の生のこのトーク久々に見ましたけれども、まだまだ好奇心を失っていないようで安心しました。皆さんはどのように感じられましたでしょうか。ぜひコメント欄の方に皆さんの感想を書いてください。それではまた他の動画でお会いしましょう。ごーしんでした。チャンネル登録よろしくね。またね。